Hello, souls and demons. I hope you've been enjoying my stories every single day. So, today I have 3 stories for you to listen to. So sit back, grip your seats, get comfortable, and enjoy. Today's first story is called Vengeance by Objective Tell 6047. The house was very silent with only one soul living in it. He never knew how empty his home would feel. He ate his measly meal of mac and cheese out of a bowl, enough to feed his hunger, but nothing like a home-cooked meal. Wedding photos adorned the walls and lamp table, all taunting him like hobgoblins about his past. He took his dirty bowl to the sink, now starting to overflow with unclean dishes. He never had the energy to wash anything in there. He could see his neighborhood from the kitchen window. It was a quiet area, aside from the incident 2 years ago. The pleasant silence of suburban life had been disturbed by the sounds of emergency vehicles and police lights. His wife had been found dead in their bedroom by him when he came home from working late, he claimed. The police found her in their bed, signs of an overdose from medication she was taking. He had come back from his flashbacks to see something unusual. Underneath a streetlight across his house, between the flickering of the light, he could see a tall, lanky human figure standing beneath the light. Though he couldn't make out every detail, he could see the figure looked like a woman standing there. She stood motionless underneath the lamp while facing the house. He stood in the kitchen, not sure who would be out this late. Everyone in the neighborhood had been inside by now. The lamp had turned off completely for a few seconds before turning back on. The woman was no longer there. He looked around the neighborhood through his window and saw no sign of her. She simply vanished. The event struck him as odd, but not worth investigating. He spent the rest of the night in his king-sized bed, now too large for one person. He thought about the last night they had together. He thought how he loved her, but could never stand her mental state anymore. He thought he heard the creaking of a door somewhere, but remembered all the doors were locked. He chalked it up to being the small tricks of the mind when one is alone. He drifted to sleep around 10 p.m., thinking of his wife, and sleeping on the pillow he used to smother his wife when she took enough of the medication to fool the medical examiner. He was jolted awake with the sensation that someone had entered his house, and indeed this very room. He tried to move his head to examine his surroundings, only to find he couldn't move. He couldn't move his head or his limbs. He had slipped into a fear-filled paralysis. The only things he could move were his chest, as his breathing became shallow and quickened, and his eyes. They moved toward the closet as he could hear the door open. What came out was a tall, thin female figure, skin gray and rotted like a walking corpse. The air around her reeked of a foul, decomposing odor coupled with a deep chill. She moved one leg at a time on her lanky, stiff limbs. Her long, matted black hair covered half her face, with only one piercing eye of a sickly yellow shade. As she moved closer and towered over him, he could recognize the face of his dead wife. She approached the bed while he remained motionless by either fear or some unnatural force that prevented him from moving. She sat on his midsection, staring at him deeply with her yellow eye. He gave no response other than a whimper, his paralysis rendering him unable to make a louder sound. He was a prisoner in his own body, watching her but not able to do anything. She raised her thin, skeletal hands and wrapped them around his throat. Her hands were surprisingly strong while her thin, rotting fingers were crushing his windpipe. He struggled unsuccessfully. The only response he could give were tears filling his eyes. The last thing he saw before he faded out of consciousness were her yellow teeth, revealed by her sinister grin. Alright, hope you enjoyed that last story. Nothing like a good revenge story, am I right? This next one is called There's a Corpse in My Bed by Objective Tell 6047. I used to be a total horror junkie. My main favorites were all the slasher movies from the 80s. I had posters of all the big characters, Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, etc. If you name the character, I probably had some representation of them as a poster or figurine. I even got into the newer names of horror, like Five Nights at Freddy games, even though they are old now. Then I had an experience as a teenager that made me rethink what horror is to me. Nowadays I find nothing scarier than real life, or what people can do to each other. I never knew feelings of fear or dread until I found a corpse in my bed and learned what happened to her. During my junior year of high school, my parents moved us to a small town in northern Ohio. My parents, who worked for the same company, had gotten a transfer, leading to a raise in a slightly better house. We moved into a 2-story white house that sat on a back road. The nearest neighbors were about a mile away. I considered it to be a literal middle of nowhere place. My parents had gotten a good deal on the house. There was nothing wrong with the house itself. The plumbing was working, there was no stains anywhere. The house was in rather good shape. The only thing was that the last owner had left a few of their possessions behind. A few clothes and appliances were still there when we arrived. The real estate agent said that the last owner had left in a hurry. A few house payments were missed before anyone knew what happened. It seemed weird to my parents, but not a deal breaker. We moved in immediately. Everything that the owner left behind was stored and sold off. I started to like the house and property after a while. I had my first backyard and it was big. At the end of our property was our neighbor's farming fields, but their house was still a way out there. I started doing okay at the new school and made some new friends after the first couple days. Then one night, it had happened. Something that robbed me of my ability to sleep in that house ever again. My parents had a client party one night, so I was left alone with our dog, Benji. We were watching my top slasher film, Nightmare on Elm Street, the original one. I thought Robert Englund had done an amazing job of it. I was near the middle of the movie when I heard the call of nature. I paused the movie so I wouldn't miss anything of which I had already seen hundreds of times. Benji was sleeping on the sofa when I had left. The bathroom was downstairs and just outside of it was a window that was overlooking the backyard. I finished my business and walked out to hear Benji downstairs, barking loudly at something. It sounded like he was in the kitchen below me. I was going back downstairs when I checked out the window when I saw something strange. The back light wasn't on, so I admit I couldn't see anything under the dim moonlight. But I swear that I could make out the shape of a person in my backyard. Their back to me. I walked back downstairs and through the kitchen where I could reach the door to the backyard. Benji was at the door, still barking. I switched the back light on and saw nothing out there. I stepped further to get a better view, but there was still nothing there. I stood where I was for about a minute to be sure. I guess it was my imagination, I decided. Plus, Benji does tend to bark at nothing. We went back to watching the movie while I was feeling slightly unnerved. As the movie ended, I deduced I had spooked myself. The constant movie consumption and late-night pasta readings had finally gotten to me. I was feeling tired and went up to my room, which was also upstairs. Benji went with me. I needed him with me because something was not right. I felt like someone was in the house with me, even though I'm supposed to be alone. We reached the top of the stairs and I noticed the air around me felt colder. Like cold as ice. This was September going into October in Ohio. It doesn't get this cold for no reason. I could even see my breath as I walked upstairs. I walked to my closed bedroom door and felt the temperature in the well-insulated house drop further. I turned the doorknob, the cold metal burning my skin as I gripped it. I turned the cold metal and opened the door. the wood creaking loudly throughout the house. My darkened room was heavy with the air of dread and death, bile rising in my throat as a reaction to my fear. Though the room was dark, I could still make out shapes of my bed, my desk, and other possessions. I wondered what was causing my anxiety until I looked closer at my bed. The covers were pulled over neatly, and under them I could make out a human-looking shape beneath the covers. I rubbed my eyes, believing that this was an illusion. Then I looked back and realized this was no trick of my eyes. There was the shape of a body beneath my covers, as if it was in a morgue. Judging from how much space it was taking up in my bed, the shape was roughly my size. I had remained frozen in my spot as I watched the human shape occupying my bed, stagnant beneath the covers. I couldn't tell because it was so dark, but I could have sworn I've seen the slight rising and falling of breathing coming from there. The shape started rising slowly until sitting upright. The blanket slipped off, revealing the scarred, dead face of a pale girl. She had small cuts and bruises covering her face. She wore a dirty t-shirt, her arms looking skinned as flesh was exposed. She went from sitting upright to be standing on my mattress. Benji was not growling at the ghostly intruder, but instead whimpered as he backed away. Her clothes had been covered in dirt and dried blood, torn all over. After standing straight up and towering over me, she raised her arms slowly and pointed toward the window. She opened her mouth to an impossibly wide gape and let out a blood-curdling scream that caused reverberations throughout the house. This was a kind of scream filled with suffering and torment as her eyes buried deep within me. I ran out of the room and downstairs to run away from the sight of the dead girl and the horrid scream that filled the whole empty house. Benji ran with me as we bolted out of the house. We made it out to the road when my parents had finally come home. Sensing my distress, I told them what I had seen, and they went upstairs to investigate. Of course, there was nothing there. They told me I probably had a nightmare, even though I was not asleep then. They advised that I should cut back on the late-night movies. I didn't sleep in my room that night, instead choosing the sofa downstairs. I started thinking maybe I psyched myself into a really vivid nightmare and started to forget about the dead girl I saw. That is, until a few days later. My dad was starting to make a garden in our backyard during the afternoon. I had been helping him that day. While digging, we heard Benji barking in the center of the yard. He had been digging over there himself, and he must have found something. Dad and I had gone over there to see what was wrong, and he had retched when he saw the decomposing remains of a human hand. He called 911 and a team was sent over to dig up the yard. It wasn't just a hand that was buried, but a whole person. Even more disturbing than this gruesome discovery was that it was the girl who I had seen in my room a few nights ago. She was heavily decomposing, maggots all over her body and feasting on her remains. It took a while before we learned anything about who she was and what happened to her. When we did, I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. The girl had been identified as Catherine Winters, a local high school student who had been missing for almost a whole year. She had been last seen leaving the school after club activities and had walked home. She hadn't been seen since. Months had gone by without any leads, and the police had all but exhausted their resources. As for the state she'd been found in, the mortician found several disturbing details surrounding the young girl's beaten and bloodied body. There had been red marks and indentations around her wrists, indicating she had been bound in handcuffs or shackles. The same marks could be found around her ankles. There were also deep bruises on her legs where it was determined someone had shattered her leg bones. Someone didn't want her to run away while they continued to torture her. Judging from her body shape, she must have been held captive for months, receiving food and water very rarely if at all. She had been starved and dehydrated for a long amount of time. When she hadn't been neglected, she had been tortured. There were burn marks around her body where perhaps a lighter or a lit cigarette or cigar had contacted her skin. She also had cuts and more bruises around her body. In some areas, she had patches of skin missing from her body. One of her eyes had also suffered damage. The thought of her torture was downright chilling and nauseating. There was, however, one more detail that, whenever I think about it, a chill runs down my spine. There were some dry DNA samples found between her thighs, suggesting she had been sexually assaulted by her captor. Most likely, this had gone on for some time. Even more disturbing was that there were traces of relatively fresh samples found, which points to her being sexually assaulted post-mortem. The captor may have kept her body from decomposing faster, so he could continue to violate her lifeless body. The last act of dominance of a sick man over a dead girl. The killer and captor had buried Catherine in the backyard before leaving, possibly being seen by someone, or had gone to a new town in search for a new victim. Catherine had been cremated after the autopsy, and her remains were returned to her family. It seemed at last they had found some closure, but no justice. Meanwhile, the previous owner of the house was being tracked down by the authorities. I had never told anyone about seeing her a few nights before. That had been my secret until now. I never slept very well in that house until after moving out, and even then, I think about it on most nights. I replay my ghostly encounter in my mind and think about her pointing to the window, to the backyard, and the pain-filled banshee scream. I started thinking about what happened and why. Was Catherine Winters trying to tell me where her body was? Was she trying to tell me what she had gone through? Was she trying to get closure for her grieving family? Real life can be more horrifying than any work of fiction. I had realized that on the night I found a corpse in my bed. I'm an excavator in Russia. I think we uncovered something huge. I wouldn't call myself wildly successful. I do what I have to do to get by. It's not ideal to be excavating in the harsh Russian climate, but I had gotten used to it after a year or so. It was almost isolating, being the only one for miles, the snow blanketing the ground in sheets. Not many people wanted to do the job, so it was our job to uncover the things that society had left behind. I needed the money, so that's why when I heard of an operation off of Moscow, I packed my bags and left. The sound of heavy machinery complemented the chatting of busy workers. I stepped out from the van and saw a rather large crater on the ground. Confused, I approached a man with a shovel. "Hey, what's with the crater?" He turned around and opened his mouth. "Supervisor says this is where we'll dig and said he'll pay extra." My eyebrow raised, but I didn't bother to ask anything else. I took in the scene around me, white for miles, and I breathed in the crisp air. The dig site was just a blemish, a pimple, in a land of white. Backhoes went about their business, and I grabbed a spade and set to work. It was about an hour before one of the trenches hit something hard. The clack sounded out through the pit, and we all gathered around what looked to be a bone. "What the hell?" The operator of the trencher got out to inspect the thing. It was huge and white, wider than the snow that was beginning to fall, covering the ground. First, the trencher unearthed a spine, then an arm. We all gaped at this thing in the ground, slowly being revealed. At this point, the snow fell in waves and we could barely see. We decided to pack up and call it a day, and headed back to camp. The next day we headed back, shovels in hand, to uncover the rest of the skeleton. I should have known better. I should have known it wasn't natural. We all saw how huge it was. It couldn't have been a fossil. It just couldn't have been. As more of it became visible, tensions were at an all-time high. One of my close friends, Hugh, approached me. "Hey man, are you seeing this? What could it be?" I stared ahead at the trenchers hard at work. The spine was now almost completely unearthed. "Something huge," I commented, and we both shared a laugh. Suddenly, a loud snap, and I saw a dragline excavator go down hard. It hit the ground and collapsed inward, the large line snapping, sending it into a frenzied spinning. I dove out of the way of a piece of metal, flying in my direction. As I looked up from my position on the floor in horror, I saw the bones begin to shift. Whatever that thing was shifted the ground, sending people screaming in all directions. I froze in terror as whatever the thing was broke from the ground. I was showered in dirt and snow, and the thing rose to its feet. It was big, blocking out the sky. It moved as if it were weighed down, breaking anything in its way. I marveled at the thing, until Hugh screamed at me, "What the hell are you doing? Get out of here!" The thing turned back around and started, to my horror, back towards the dig site. Each step like an explosion, shaking the ground and sending shivers up my entire body. Hugh stood, frozen, entranced by the thing. I pushed him and nudged him, but nothing worked. It was getting closer. The thing was only bones, attached only by a thin layer of rubbery skin. The head was that of a goat, the skull bleached white. I didn't stick around to see what it would do. I shrieked and ran to my van. I got in and slammed the door and sped out of there, burning rubber on the snow. I did not look back, even when I could hear the screams of those who never made it out of that place. I still think about Hugh a lot. I regret not doing more to save him. Each night I pray for his safety. I've tried contacting my job, anyone linked to it, but never got an answer. We weren't a big company, and I doubted the story would make it big. No missing person reports were filed. I don't know what to do. I still regret finding that skeleton. I guess some things are just meant to be left alone. I wish I'd known that before I dug up that horrible thing.